Broadcasting from Washington, D.C., this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This episode of Insider's Guide to Energy EV miniseries is powered by Power. Power helps your business transition to electric vehicles by simplifying charging, managing payments, and optimizing your charging data. Welcome to another edition of the Insider's Guide to Energy EV series. Niall, what do we got going on this week?
This is one of my favorite topics. We are going to be talking about commercial fleet electrification and all the challenges that come with that. And we're super lucky because we have today with us someone who has taught me pretty much everything I know about this space. And to those British listeners, she'll be a very familiar name. But for those more further afield, we might need to introduce Lorna McAtear, who is the fleet manager for National Grid here in the UK. Welcome to the podcast, Lorna.
Thanks very much. No, I like that intro. You can do that again.
So we're here talking about commercial fleets. And one of the things that I really struggled with and still struggle with today is the definition of what is a fleet. It's a quite ambiguous statement. Would you help us unpack that statement?
Yeah, and I think you've touched on one of the first definitions already just in that question, which is commercial fleet. But even in that commercial fleet space, cars often get bundled in. So you have car fleets when you work as a fleet manager, you have commercial fleets, and as heads of fleet, you often get to run all of them. And so you often need lots of different definitions. So you've got salary sacrifice is one way of getting vehicles into the teams. That tends to be run by HR people, but fleets are often involved in a lot as well. As I said, you've got your company car fleets. You have grey fleet, which are people who drive business, hire vehicles, but don't actually own their own car. US people are very familiar with that because they get stipends instead, which end up giving them cash allowances as the equivalent in the UK as well. So there are all sorts of different ways of doing the car side of things. And then you get commercial, which we tend to think of as things that are branded, although you can get some cars that are branded. And the commercial stuff that is branded as well tends to be vans, but then you go into size and different regulations. So in the US, you'll be talking in sizes in terms of pound weights. And in the UK, we talk about 3.5 tons as being a threshold for O license. And then you're into a whole different world of commercial fleet as well when you get to the O license, because you have your TACA regulations and your CPC holders and all sorts of different things. Basically, a whole bunch of rules and regulations. And in Europe, it's at 2 ton. Because it changed. So it different weights in different countries on what you do and what it means and how all of that is invoked across different places. So just that definition for you just makes it nice and easy.
It's a complex little world that we're living in. And what I tend to come back to is this idea that ultimately the vehicles that make up these fleets are the bits that keep the wheels on business and keep businesses moving. But every fleet is unique pretty much in its own right. They've all got different characteristics, different vehicles. Can you tell us a bit about your fleet?
Yeah, so where a lot of that comes in on those characteristics things and differences, even in utilities, we may operate things differently. Some of us may choose to buy, some of us may choose to lease, and then that affects the relationships you have with your suppliers or what you do at an end of life with a vehicle. So absolutely unique in what you do. Some of us will rack things out, some of us don't. You talk final mile fleets, so your postal services, your delivery companies, and you've got a whole different set of challenges with those as well. So my fleet is made up of cars, commercial vehicles, small panel vans. I've got a lot of 4x4 vehicles because we do go off-road and we do lots of work putting in pylons and getting to places that aren't easy to get to or don't have roads in the first place. And then we got some really fancy, quirky, really unique low loaders, high abs, which are the lifting equipment, and everything else, MUPs, loads of references that you won't come across, which is all the different specialist funky equipment that I really like to play around with. That's where I kind of started fleet, was on the commercial, difficult to do stuff.
And we're here talking about electrification, and quite frankly, most people will be familiar with electric cars by now, and increasingly we're seeing more and more electric vans. You've just described a couple of vehicle types that I think I have a rough idea what you're talking about, but they're effectively all of the funkier vehicles that need to do the hard tasks. How are we going to electrify that little lot? Because it can't be a big mass market like your average passenger car.
No, and it's been a difficult market for fleets, full stop. Even if we talk ICE, there's always been challenges in a manufacturer pulling out, and then you haven't been left with an option. So when the Range Rover stopped doing the Defenders, you didn't have many choices in your other 4x4. So it's always been a problem for us in those niche areas. Throw in different fuel types and you get a whole raft of different challenges. Throw in people's perceptions of which fuel type is going to win the race, and you get another raft of challenges coming in there as well. So personally, I think everything can go electric. It just takes time and it takes effort and it takes a different way of looking at things.
You talked about a very diverse set of vehicles.
Yeah.
I would think the ownership profile would vary. So the time that you own, let's say, an excavator or some sort of heavy piece of equipment, you might write that off over a longer period of time than a passenger vehicle or a Defender, as you described. I would expect that you would either lease or own those for a shorter period of time. So are there different profiles, and is that going to impact the electrification? Because if I've got a 10-year return on this investment or a 5-year return on the investment, it should be different than, let's say, a passenger car.
Absolutely. And one of the bits of advice I gave a fleet manager who used to take their vehicles for 5 years, they were struggling to build a business case to go electric because of the higher upfront costs. So whilst everybody else is giving all these complex answers on what they could, should do and how to talk to the board, I just went, extend it by a year. Because actually, if you make that total cost of ownership better, and we know the maintenance costs are cheaper, and we know other things are lower price, then it's an easier one to do. So you're absolutely right. All the different types of vehicles and how hard you use them off-road or in emergency situations will affect what you do with it. So I'm always giving out advice on the electrification journey on how to look at what you use, how you use it, where it goes home to, where that vehicle sleeps at night, because all of that impacts your decisions and what can be easy to change versus the more difficult ones to change.
One of the things that we talked about previously with a gentleman called Paul Kirby was this idea that commercial vehicles ultimately help people earn a living or create revenue, and therefore their usage is often much, much higher. You've been running a number of commercial electric vehicles for a while now. Are you starting to see differences in operational pattern against what a passenger car might see?
So this is where some of your more unique challenges come into the vehicles, and this is politely why I have some frustrations with people who make policies and decisions, because they do them based on their experience of a car and haven't got a Scooby-Doo how to operate a commercial vehicle. And you're absolutely right. If you take one of my previous jobs I had, Royal Mail, some of those vehicles were utilised 24 hours. It's the driver that changes, not the vehicle. So when you've got people assuming that a commercial vehicle goes back to the depot at 5 o'clock at night and it's parked up and it goes straight on a charger and it never goes out again, it's totally incorrect. So what you do is you change your shifts. You put a new driver in that vehicle, it goes out again. Anyone in the HGV sector, you're always utilising those vehicles, double manning the crews, whatever it is. That is your asset. That is where the money is. That is what you have to look after. And that's what you keep running as much as you possibly can. So you'll always hear fleets talk about downtime, uptime, management. This is where it all comes into play. Throw in electric or a different fuel type, hydrogen, any of the biofuels, and you've got different challenges on what you can and can't do and how you make that work.
That's interesting. So understanding that rapid charging may deteriorate your battery, do you have to overbuy vehicles or overbuy capacity so you have time to slow charge it, or do you just rapid charge and keep the vehicle less time?
Good questions. Depends on your operation and how you work. And these are all the things as fleet managers we have to think about as we're going forward. But don't forget that the architecture is changing in those vehicles. The battery type is changing in those vehicles. So those more complex vehicles actually will end up with a different technology in them compared to what we've got in the cars today. So what we can do and how quickly we can charge those batteries will change. And all it means is, in a lot of cases, just a different way of thinking. Think outside the box a bit more. And this is where, again, fleet managers have to consider, is that charging port at the front of the vehicle or the rear of the vehicle? If you're a final mile delivery company or you're loading goods, you back that vehicle onto a loading bay, you want your charge port where you can charge without causing a trip hazard while you load that vehicle. If you're a utility vehicle, you want to work out of the back of the vehicle, so you don't want the charging point anywhere near the back because you're actually working there all the time. So these are the differences that we have to overcome. And if you're using your depot and you've put those charging bays at the rear ready to for your loading stuff, and then you go to a different manufacturer who's put all the charging ports at the front of the vehicle, then you've got to turn your vehicle around. You've got to do something different again. It just makes things very, very difficult in how you design what you're doing, as well as how you use those vehicles as well. But none of it's insurmountable. Technology is changing.
And one of the things that's interesting about that technology changing is we can see more and more passenger cars come into the market all the time. But it does seem, when I speak to other fleet managers and other businesses considering the transition, that quite a lot is often raised about range, payload, cost, and the challenges with the selection of vans available on the market. How do you overcome some of those issues around limited choice?
So there are a couple of things in there. One, this isn't new for fleet managers. It's always been the case. HGVs get the tech first and it comes down to vans. Cars get the tech first and it comes up to vans. Whichever way you want to look at it, vans are always the poor, insignificant partner of everybody else out there. Just probably because of the margins or how we use them. But that's just a fact and we have to live with it. It is not going to change. So suck it up, deal with it. The other thing that goes on with that one as well then is actually you get some advantages when it comes down because you can see the tech is changing. Now, yes, there are some regulations out there. You've got the ZEV mandate, you've got some other bits and pieces. Yes, we do have range anxiety when it comes to the commercial vehicles because the difference on a commercial vehicle, you generally have timeframes and set times. And as I said, you're utilizing those vehicles a lot more as well. So in some respects, vans being later, as long as they benefit from the new technology, well, it's not a problem. And I've got a couple more cycles before I can't buy anyway. So why don't I concentrate on the vehicles that I can do and can control and then help the manufacturers design the vehicles I want in the future? So that is what I do a lot of. I work with those manufacturers, say, there's a problem with that bit. Actually, your 12-volt battery on there is a problem. It's not the battery itself here, it's this bit. You need to change that, or you need your wiring looms different, or you need this EPTO, which is an electronic power takeoff. You need that instead. So it's what else can we do to help those manufacturers and learn from the mistakes we made on the cars, learn from what's coming down from the HGVs, and see what we can do on that instead.
When I listen to you speak, if I were running a fleet, I'd be holding off because it sounds like it's very volatile and changing. So I would be afraid to be buying things. If you're continually building the truck as we're riding in it, so to speak, that would make me nervous to invest in the new technology. How do you deal with that?
And there's a lot of fleet managers who are actually thinking like that, but they're getting caught out with the ZEV mandate and some of the other bits and pieces. They're getting caught at the back of the queue, and then they haven't learned enough lessons. They haven't got their drivers buy-in. They're then falling foul of all the myths that are coming out from the newspapers and the press because they believe in what's going on in the doom mongering side, rather than actually working on the ones that they can, doing the things that they can do, and just steadily working through a plan. That's all they need. A fleet, just get a target in place, work towards it, because some of that target might not be until 2029, 2035, whatever it is, and just work your way through.
And you mentioned an interesting part of the equation. It was the human in that equation because you said you have to get the people caught up. So we went from talking about technology and vehicles to not having the people ready for this. Help me understand what that means.
So when we talk people, you've got your driver, you have your line managers, and then we'll skip a bunch of others because it depends how many senior levels you want, but then you go right to the top, don't you, and your execs. And you need buy-in from everybody, and you're going to get it at different stages from different people. We cannot get away from the human factor. Some people like change and thrive on it, others detest it with a passion, and therefore you have to work your way through that. First thing, and some of the advice I give to other fleet managers out there is, get to the execs, get the buying, find out what it is that's motivating your company. Is it that they will have a product to sell as a result of this, in which case that's your angle in? Is it that they've got sustainability targets and fines? Go through that angle. What is it that is pushing your company to make a decision? What makes it tick? What are its values? And work at that level. Get your finance director on board, because once you've got them on board, everything else just trickles through. Because if they say no to the money, you're not buying anything anyway. So get that finance director on board, sanction all the costs that you've got that are coming through, get your budgets in place for the future, and then everything else just trickles its way down. If you've got sustainability teams that you have to report with, get them on board, because they're going to need the details from you and your input. And actually, if you've got cars, getting your cars done and your small vans that are the easier to do ones, getting them in helps them tick their boxes, and they suddenly become, or you become, their best friend, because you're helping them achieve their targets. Then you've got the drivers. Find the drivers that are really keen, because you have got some. You've got some that are really passionate about doing this. Get them on board. Work in teams. Get out there. So we rotate a team at a time. We don't put 2 EVs in and then leave a bunch of diesels, because they'll ditch one for the other. They'll go through a preference. So actually do the whole team, but go out there and talk to them. Actually physically hand over and spend time with them. You get rid of 90% of the myths in that one face-to-face handover and spending time with them. And then you've got that sandwich layer, the line managers. They're actually sometimes the more difficult ones, because they've got to change the way they work. And that's something that everyone forgets with the fleets. We can't do what we used to do. We might in the future, but right now we can't. So the sooner they accept that and stop going to the same person that puts their hand up every single time for overtime, they've actually got to do some planning. They've got to do a little bit of thought around the work. And this is where it goes all the way back to the points I made at the beginning, which is understand how you use your vehicles, where they go, where they sleep, who influences it, and what you need to do with it. Because there is a solution there. You just have to know what the problem is.
And for me, the biggest thing that's always changing, is people's perspectives once they've been in an electric vehicle and had that experience. But sometimes getting that person who's a little bit reticent into the vehicle is quite hard. How do you handle that early conversation when you turn around and go, by the way, we're taking your lovely, comfortable diesel away and we're giving you this newfangled technology? Tell me how that experience goes with drivers and what you can do to shape people's first impression.
It's an interesting one. And the reason I say that's interesting is I've been doing this for a long time now. I'm not quite sure I can remember. Because as you said, once you've got enough people in it, it's easier to do. But you'll also know that I'm the kind of person that won't do anything I don't expect a driver to do. So I've driven some of those really difficult to do vehicles. Drove a high roof transit from John O'Groats to Land's End. So for those that aren't in the UK, that's literally the top of the country all the way to the opposite end. And it was great until I got to a few service areas and they've got height restrictions because they didn't want the caravans in, which meant that the van couldn't go in. And guess where the chargers were? They'd been designed for cars, so they were behind those height restrictions. And it's these things that we took, we learned, we fed them back, because yes, we've got difficult drivers that still don't want to go on the journey. But we are so early in this journey, the number of drivers you can get in still outweigh the difficult ones. So there is no point forcing someone into a vehicle where they're still doing 40,000 miles, don't have home charging, can't do anything else, when actually, if you leave it another 5 years, the technology will have moved, you'll have the answers, you'll have a better infrastructure, you'll understand the challenges more, and therefore their conversion will be easier. Whereas if you force them now, they'll kick back. They'll fight you all the way. So there's no point. Don't have a battle that you can't win. It's not worth it.
And this point about early in the journey is really interesting, because we tend to talk about this adoption curve. You get the innovators right at the front, the first 2.5%, then you get your early adopters up to about 12-13%. But you as a business now, National Grid, must be getting some pretty significant late majority into cars.
Yeah, we're kind of, if you think, because we've put in the policies and we are going EV now. I say EV, we may use some other decarbonising tapes in the heavier vehicles, but in theory, we are going for net zero at the tailpipe. Let's get my terminology as correct as I can get it. We are now entering into that mass. So we've got lots of people now who they're not being given a choice. Whereas before, as you said, it was those early adopters, the first ones. Out of 3,000 company cars, we've now got 2,000 that are pure electric. The diesels that are still on fleet are the handful that are washing their way out. They're literally coming to the ends of their lease life and will be changed. We do still have some hybrids, because we do acknowledge some of the distances we go and the personal circumstances for some of the people just can't quite make it work yet. That will change. Don't send this podcast out to too many of my staff yet, but that will change. And it's just working it through and getting the timing right on it. So it's understanding that journey. But with 2,000 in pure electrics, none of them have come back to me and said, I want out. So that's the message that then goes around to everybody else. So when they're sitting having their coffees together and somebody says, I've got an electric van coming, they go, yeah, but you've got this on it when you get it, or it's not as bad as you think when you go to charge. So the other thing you've got as well, as more people get into electric vehicles in a company, their spouses, other halves, family, friends, they start to see what it is as well. So actually you use that as your communication media to help get people into the vehicles because it's easier, because they get the real life experience, not the perceived press and those that haven't had their bum on a seat in a vehicle experience. They're actually getting the drivers who have done it, been there, learned, understood, worked their way through it, and you use them to get that message out.
All right. So we've talked a lot about EVs, but you mentioned alternative fuel types and things earlier in the interview. This is an EV series, but we're an energy podcast. And some of your unique equipment, I'm wondering if biodiesel or hydrogen or something like that may not be your near term, or is everything going to be electrified in your view? Am I going to have unique equipment that is electrified?
So, at risk of upsetting either one side of the fence or the other side of the fence, I'm actually open minded. So, when I say I'm open minded, I've always had a mantra in the fleet world, and it's always been right vehicle, right job. That mantra is now extended to right vehicle, right job, right fuel type, right time. Now, biofuels, there are several types of biofuels. Some of them mean I have to do a lot of work with the tanks and they'll degrade over time. So if I don't use it fast enough and it's in a backup generator, then actually it goes off and it's useless. If I use one of the other types, it's classed as a drop-in fuel. And that one I can use, it's fairly easy. And you've got other companies out there, especially on the HGVs, using it already. Both of those have a finite resource level though. So if we're talking about sustainability, it's not just looking at what's right for you in that vehicle. It's again, what is right and what is available holistically across all vehicle types and for other people. I could be totally selfish, couldn't I? I could just do my vehicles and say, that's it, I'm just looking after me. But it's what's out there. And some of those biofuels just aren't as sustainable, or there isn't enough of it for everybody to go down that route. The other one we're looking at, and I am exploring in some cases, is hydrogen. But again, with hydrogen, there isn't enough of it. There's not enough green stuff. Whether you can electrolyze it or not, hydrogen is better if you use it where it is made, so that you don't have to go through all the shipping side of it, because using ammonia and nitrogen and other methods of carrier in order to move that around is challenging. It's not as cost effective yet. We do know those vehicles are also more expensive than the electric ones. So if you think a fleet manager's got a headache now trying to electrify, try and do it with a hydrogen infrastructure that doesn't exist yet either. So, but having said all of that, if you're in a location where hydrogen is abundant and easy for you to get to, of which there is one or two locations, why wouldn't you do it? So back to my mantra, right vehicle, right job, right fuel type, right time.
I like this story. So in that hard to treat ecosystem, that stuff that's on the late end of your journey, what are you tackling at the moment to decarbonize? What's moving to zero tailpipe emissions in the correct corporate language? Because I'm conscious that we do see a lot of cars. We've got an increasing number of vans. What about things like 4x4s?
So 4x4s are a challenge, as you can imagine, because it's not the 4x4 itself, it's what it's used for. So it tows. And the moment you stick anything on an alternative fuel vehicle at the moment that tows, then you degrade its performance. So it's getting that balance right. And another one of the words we're often using in the fleet world is operational efficiency. Whatever it is, we have to have operational efficiency. I can't have something towing 3.5 ton that can only do 2 miles, because once it's used up its burst of energy, that's it, and we're stuck there, am I? So it's a very practical option. But I knew that back in 2020 when I put my plan together for 2030, assuming my 2030 date was going to stay. And I knew I wasn't even going to tackle my 4x4s until 2027, because I wasn't expecting anything to come to the market. Doesn't mean I haven't been working with disruptors in the background, designing vehicles, talking to them, working out what's needed, dual passenger or passenger airbags, because we have 2-man crews. So I can't take one that doesn't have a passenger airbag. So there's all sorts of things in the fleet world we have to consider, and we just keep feeding that back in. to the disruptors. Here's more info, here's more info. So for the last 2 to 3 years, I've probably been helping people design, even though I haven't taken any of those vehicles yet.
And what's interesting is I'm super aware that you need vehicles that have been, I hate this word, homologated.
Homologated, well done.
Homologated, there we go. Which means that they have gone through all the tests required to enable them to be, mass-produced, road legal, etc.
Correct.
And that clearly is a challenge when you're getting into these small batch
Correct.
type vehicles. How do you see that evolving over the next few years?
So we've got some of the bigger players coming out now. So once you've got a lot of these early prototypes that are done, you're now moving. So there's some other phrases as well. So you have small type approval, you have individual vehicle approval, and then you have whole type approval. So they're all the different scales, and it's the number of vehicles you are allowed to make under that production banner, so to speak. Just trying to keep it as easy language as I can without offending anyone. And then what you have there is when you get into whole type approval, you're looking at over 1,000 vehicles. Now, bearing in mind, I've got 1,500 4x4s on my fleet in the UK. If you take every utility with roughly those same numbers, it's hard for us to take the smaller ones until you've got further along the line. So we can for trials sometimes. There are different things we can do. But any disruptor coming in, of course, if you think, yay, it's great, even OEMs, when they come out with their brand new vehicle, we've got 1,000 coming to the UK. It's like, right, they're all going to go then, aren't they, in one hit? Royal Mail's going to go out there and buy the whole lot up in the first batch. What are you doing for the rest of us? Kind of thing. So for anyone that doesn't know, Royal Mail in the UK has 50,000 vehicles. So it's the biggest fleet. So it's understanding all those different types and what we can do. But 4x4s are starting to come through. As I said, I'd predicted 2027 anyway through conversations. And we're starting to see those changes come out and more mass production and the disruptors having got further through each of their stages of homologation and road legal testing.
Is there a difference in the performance of the 4x4s with the weight, the batteries, and anything like that? So do you have to retrain your drivers to handle how to use this 4x4 as opposed to just putting it in low and locking the hubs and going type of thing?
So we try to train all of the drivers anyway, because it's just a different style of driving. And yeah, the torque on it, as we all know, torque on an electric vehicle is so much better and easier. So in some respects, it simplifies what we're doing. In others, because we do all the training for familiarization on those vehicles anyway, because you've got cranes on there that you have to familiarize them with, you just do the whole thing in one hit again. So you just go back over it all and try and understand what it can and can't do. And I guess one of the other things I forgot with fleet, we've got a lot of plant. So sometimes these vehicles get classed as plant instead of on the road. So everything from your forklift to your ATV, your all-terrain vehicles, and your other ones that have got the chains, look like little tanks. So you've got all sorts of different vehicles that go out there as well. No idea I'm getting those. We'll get there eventually.
It's quite an
I have faith.
that you've got to ultimately persuade manufacturers to get to a point where they can produce everything in electric. We are starting to see some of those more obscure vehicles coming through. One of the things I'm really interested in, because we're kind of future forecasting at the moment, you talked about getting some of the last of your car drivers into electric vehicles. What do you think has to change in order to get those last drivers? So this is completely different to our normal conversations. We were talking about the beginning, and now we're talking about the end. What has to change to get?
You've also gone to cars instead of commercials.
Well, I think it's kind of easier to understand how the cars might get to the end, because you're so much further down the line now. What do you think has to change for someone who does 50,000 miles a year and doesn't have home charging and all the other challenges they face?
I think there's a few things. If I remember back to National Grid putting my strategy in place, I got it approved just before we locked down. But part of what I was doing, I had a huge whiteboard next to my desk where we were and where all my team sat. And on that whiteboard was a list of all the cars coming through. And I'd circled when they were hitting the road, which ones were over 200 miles. And I'd put in there that was for August 2020. We were expecting that. Bear in mind, we did all that before COVID, so things slipped a little bit. But that was what was coming through. And I'd marked that date. And anybody that walked by kind of went, what's that for? And I went, that's the tipping point. That's the change that will get people out of some of the vehicles into EVs, because 200 miles is now a realistic range. We're now getting to where it's 300 miles in the cars. And we're now getting to where we've got more affordable cars, where the price points have really come down in what's happening. So each year that goes by, actually, that is what is changing. We're not in the position now that we were 4 years ago. And this is one of the other things I say to people, why do I have faith that I'm going to get my 4x4s? Well, when I started this journey, we haven't got, I was going to say half, but it's probably we didn't even have 80% of the vehicles that we've got now. It's changing so fast. So I believe they will come. And that's one side of it. The other side of it is everybody's now understanding infrastructure and energy and generation. And we've got lots of people who've become prosumers. And for nobody who understands what the word prosumer is, because I didn't when I first used it, I had to go and Google it because I was moderating a panel on it. This is where you're both the consumer and you sell a product. So if you think about your home environment and allowing people to use your chargers at home and neighbours and everything else, we now buy and sell the own kind of product that we've got. So when you've got more into that, everybody understands what their usage is, what they need, how they go about it. So they're becoming much more informed. So I'm not going to use the word educated, becoming much more informed on what they can and can't do and how they go about it. And that's one of the big differences now. And that's just going to replicate into the commercial vehicle world as well. We've already know from all the rallies we do, we all go out and do all this stuff, that looking and planning my routes this year, because I'm using lots of these difficult to do vehicles, actually, if I tried that first year from John O'Groats to Land's End, I don't think I'd have made it, but I will this year because the amount out there has changed so much. And we've got so much more confidence in what we can and can't do out there.
All right, you got confidence, but I assume you have tools as well. Is there software that's adapted to your unique, because you don't just have a van fleet, you don't just have a car fleet, you've got kind of a lot of fleets.
There's loads of stuff. And again, when I first started...
Like a tool that you're using to do all this? Or other than the whiteboard with circles and miles?
Do you want the honest answer?
Sure. Now lie to me, please.
I'm so used to driving EVs, I can't even be bothered to plan anymore. I just get in the car and go. And then hope and pray that first services I go to, there'll be one. I now know enough of the infrastructure that I just get and go. But that's the confidence you get when you've been out for a long time. And if you've driven a van and then you go back to your car, you think you're in luxury. You really do, because you realise once you've been in that van, you're now invincible in a car. You can go anywhere in the UK because the distances just don't matter. But to be fair, your point on tools is really valid. There are so many tools out there and they've got better. The accuracy of the data is better. And it's so much better as well with the EV cards. The way the legislation changed, the fact you can have one card now that does most networks, that you don't have to go out there and have umpteen million different apps on your phone, has made a huge difference to the ease of using that infrastructure. And therefore, for people coming in that are new, it's easier for them to learn and understand because it's much more similar to what they're used to now.
So we're seeing an evolution in the driver experience. If you take the same question that Chris is posing around software to manage your fleet, how do you see that changing? Because now you've got a slightly different equation emerging around your optimization of your vehicle types. Are you looking at things like, you're going to love this one, vehicle to grid, timing and flexibility of charging? How are all these things, these modern technologies going to affect your operations?
It's all changing. And I think, Chris made a valid point earlier about fleet managers waiting. Yeah, I think there's also a load of fleet managers going, do you know what, I'm retiring. This is too much like hard work these days as well. There are so many things coming our way, and so many different skill sets, but it's also so exciting. And what you've said there, Neil, going back to that vehicle usage, if you're using a vehicle 24/7, it's just the people you're changing, you're never going to use vehicle to grid because you always want your vehicle charged. Pointless. If you are one of those fleets that rarely does come back, charges it up and everything else, then why wouldn't you? But fleet managers have so many other headaches when it comes to this, and it's so new for all of us. What do I do if I've got a driver who's been charging up at home, getting reimbursement from me as a company, and then starts plugging it back in and running this kettle off the car? How does that work? How do I manage that one when we're going through all of this? So the use of tools, and I've read an article today which was AI is going to replace the fleet manager. It's no chance. You're never going to be able to replace me. Not a chance. So what does it mean? And it's, yes, there'll be tools that help us with routing, planning, optimization, getting data to prove to the driver that when they think they do 100 miles, actually it's only 60. It may take longer because of traffic, but they don't go as far as they need and all that kind of stuff. So it's more informative, I think, and helps us with some of those basic decisions and putting things in. So that's where I think it will change.
So this for me is super exciting because we've had this conversation a couple of times, and every time I have this conversation, I come away energized and having learnt more. We've defined fleets, we've covered vehicle types, we've looked at different ways that the challenges are being addressed. And I think I'm really reflecting on is the fact that you've seen the transition and you believe that we'll continue to go on that transition. If you were going to have a quick shot at making a prediction about 24 months' time, what might we expect to see changing over the next 24 months?
I think we're going to have a lot more debate on the different architectures in vehicles and the speed of the chargers that we go in. I think there's going to be an awful lot more around DC/AC 800 versus 400 and the speeds at which those rapid chargers can or can't charge vehicles and which vehicles it goes into. And the reason I think that will all come about is you'll have technology pushing it, but then you'll have fleet managers going, don't add that cost onto my vehicle. Thank you very much. I still want to be able to do what I can do. So that I think is going to be a nice, interesting dynamic in technology.
This has been fabulous, Lorna. Thank you ever so much. It's a real pleasure to have had you as a guest on the podcast.
You're very welcome.
What a great conversation we had today. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please don't forget to subscribe, add comments, likes, and follow us on YouTube. And we'll see you again next time on the Insider's Guide to Energy EV series. Bye for now.